So I have three arguments, three ideas on the way to an argument about what I think we need to do. Number one, route striker. 1846, 20 miles from here in Walden Pond, Henry David Thoreau wrote this: "There are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who is striking at the root." Root striker. That's the first idea. Here's the second. Independence. If I mention here in Boston the idea of independence, your mind goes to 1776. I don't mean the independence that we fought for beginning in 1776. I mean instead the independence America was increasingly focusing on around 1786, a couple years before we wrote our Constitution, when most in America were recognizing that the America of the time was going to be a failure. The original Constitution was a complete failure. And a failure because there was a certain lack of independence in state governments around the country. There was an improper dependence in these governments around the country. As Jefferson put it, this kind of dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. This is what government had become. And what our framers sought was a non-dependent, we could say independent government. One that could get the right answer for the right reason. Their common aim was a set of institutions, we could call them constitutions, against improper dependence, which means for the proper dependence. So think, for example, about what we mean when we talk about an independent judiciary. We don't mean by an independent judiciary, a judiciary that can do whatever the hell it wants. We mean instead a judiciary that is, quote, dependent upon the law. It follows the law. And independence means that proper dependence. Proper dependence is what that independence is, and it's true here in the context of the judiciary and in other contexts as well. That's idea two. Here's the final idea, trust. I want you to recognize the way in which trust is a function of independence. So think about this chemical. I know one guy in the room knows what this is, nobody else, okay, but this is bisphenol A, or otherwise known as BPA. Many people ask the question whether this chemical, which is increasingly in our life, every one of us is consuming it in some form right now today as you drink from plastic bottles or expose yourself to the stuff that we will eat around lunch. Not to say anything nasty about the lunch service at all, but I'm just saying this is the way this chemical is in our environment right now. People ask, is it safe? Most of us think, of course it's safe. How could it not be safe? We have governments to protect us from unsafe chemicals, so our government didn't stop this chemical, it must be safe. But in fact, the research about this is contested, and it's contested in a very interesting way. If you distinguish between industry-funded studies evaluating the safety of BPA and independently funded studies evaluating the safety of BPA, here is the pattern of results, leading most of us now, regardless of what we thought before about the safety of BPA, to be less sure now about its safety. Or think about cell phones, these microwave radiating devices that you put within a couple inches of your brain. Are they safe? Most of us, 70% of us, believe, of course they must be safe. We've had them for 50 years. There have been governments studying this stuff forever. It's got to be safe, right? But again, research interestingly contested, and you distinguish between industry-funded and independently funded research. There is a pattern that draws many people into a point of concern. You are less sure now than you were before. Now the point is that the confidence you have is weakened when there's money present in the wrong relationship. Not money in general, but money in the wrong place. And the lesson to draw from this is that if we need to maintain confidence, and institutions, of course, in many contexts need to maintain confidence, to maintain trust, we have to secure the right independence of the institutions, or the scholars, or the researchers, or the regulators from the wrong influence. We must assure the proper dependence if we're going to trust them. All right, those are the three ideas. Here's the argument. Framers of our Constitution gave us not a democracy, that word doesn't exist in our Constitution. They gave us a republic. But we know from their writings that by a republic they meant a representative democracy. And that representative democracy had an intended dependence. As Federalist 52 puts it, this government was to have a branch that would be, quote, dependent upon the people alone. So here's the complicated model they had for our government. There's the people, there's the government. I do my own slides. That's really cool, right? The way that bounces. There's the people, there's the government. Marionette relationship, the government is dependent upon the people. That is the constitution of independence for our government. Here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not a dependence upon the people alone, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders as well. As members of Congress spend between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back in power, they develop this sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. In the words of the X-Files, they become shapeshifters, adjusting their position or view in light of what they understand will raise money, not on the top issues, not on the most important issues, but on the 150 issues below the top 10 where nobody notices except the funders. As Democrat Leslie Byrne described when she went to Congress, she was told by a colleague, quote, always lean to the green. Then she went on to clarify, he was not an environmentalist. Now, the point is, this too is a dependence. It's a dependence that our representatives have. But the problem is, it's a different and conflicting dependence, because here, surprise, surprise, the funders are not the people. The funders are not the people. Now, I want you to recognize what should be obvious. This pattern that I've just described, this is a kind of corruption. I don't mean the kind of cash secreted around among offices in brown paper bags. You know, for most of the 20th century, members of Congress had safes in their office, and in those safes there was cash. Why? They don't pay salaries by cash in Congress, but there it was, cash in those safes. But that kind of corruption is long gone at our federal level. This is the cleanest Congress we've had in our history. It's not corruption in the brown paper bag sense or even in the Rod Blagojevich sense. It's not that kind of corruption. Instead, it is a corruption of the intended dependence that our framers had. It is a dependence corruption, just like an alcoholic has a dependence corruption. A dependence that draws him away from the focus he is to have. Our Congress, our Uncle Sam, has a drinking problem. A drinking problem that draws him away from what he is supposed to do because we force him to live his life constantly in the pursuit of these campaign funds. It is the wrong dependence, and in that sense, it becomes a corruption. And the consequence of this corruption, I think, is four. Number one, policies get bent to the funders. So the study by Martin Gylens of some 887 public opinion surveys that tried to measure attitudes of the rich versus middle class and the poor and asked the question, what happens to policy when those attitudes conflict? He finds When Americans with different income levels differ in their policy preferences, actual policy outcomes strongly reflect the preferences of the most affluent, but bear virtually no relationship to the preferences of the poor or middle-income Americans. Now, some people look at that and say, well, the rich are just the most educated. I don't mean to upset people here in a university, but it turns out the rich are not the most educated. It's not the most educated that these policy preferences are following. It's those with the most influence. There is a vast discrepancy between what our Congress does and what our Congress would be doing if it were concerned with the intended dependence of our framers on the people. Number two, that leads most Americans to believe money buys results in Congress. Most in the sense of 3/4 of us. 75% of Americans believe, quote, money buys results in Congress. A little bit more Democrats than Republicans, but I can guarantee you when the Democrats controlled Congress, it was basically the same with Republicans. Whether it's 2/3 or 3/4, this is what we believe. And that leads to number three, an erosion of trust in the system. Gallup reported last year that 11% of Americans have confidence in that institution. 11%. Things have gotten a little better over the year. Now it's 12%. 12% have confidence in that institution. We have to put this in context, right? There were more people who believed in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than who believe in our Congress today. There's a fundamental lack of confidence in this institution, and at what point does it have to declare bankruptcy? Political bankruptcy, because it has lost the faith of the people. And that lack of confidence leads to number four, an erosion in participation. Rock the Vote, organization which turned out the largest number of young voters in the history of America in 2008, and arguably, therefore, elected Barack Obama president, found in 2010 that many of their people they had turned out in 2008 were not going to vote. They asked them why. The number one reason by far was, quote, no matter who wins, corporate interests will still have too much power and prevent real change. And it's not just kids who have this attitude. The vast majority who didn't vote in part, at least, because of this belief. That's my argument. Here's the question, what should we do about this? Well, if we're going to change this, we need to fix this improper dependency. If the problem is that we have a system where the funders are not the people, the solution is a system where we make the funders the people. That we give them a way. I know that looks like one word. I don't mean give Congress away, although some people would like to do that. I mean instead, give Congress a way to fund without Faust, right? Without selling their souls and without alienating America. And one way to do that is to commit to the principle of publicly funding public elections. Changing from a large dollar funded campaign system, which is our system right now, to a small dollar funded campaign system. The sort of system that Arizona, a solidly red state, Maine, a solidly red and blue state, and Connecticut, a solidly blue state, have adopted, where candidates opt in to a system where they take small dollar contributions only, and through the publicly funded system, those contributions get amplified so that they can fund their campaigns without selling their souls. Now, there are many ways to do this, but the thing I want you to focus on is if we had a system for funding elections where 80% of our members of Congress opted into this small dollar funded system only, then when Congress did something stupid, we could believe, like we all want to believe, that it may have been because there were too many Democrats or maybe because there were too many Republicans, but not because of the money. Because this critical source of cynical skepticism that all of us have when we look at that institution would have been removed. Now, my view is it's not hard to describe the problem that our Congress has. It's not hard to describe what a solution to that problem looks like. What's hard, what's impossibly hard, is to imagine how we get to that solution. And that's especially hard because of an insight told to me by a member of Congress, Jim Cooper, Democrat from Tennessee, who's been in Congress for as long as all but 20 other members of Congress. Cooper told me in an interview, the problem with Washington, the problem with Capitol Hill, is that Capitol Hill has become a farm league for K Street. K Street, the place where lobbyists live. A farm league for K Street, meaning increasingly members, staffers, and bureaucrats have this increasingly common business model in their head. Not the business model of a Mayor Menino service, public service for a long part of your life, but the business model of life focused on life after government, life as a lobbyist, life where you'll make 2 or 3 or 4 times your salary as a member of Congress as a lobbyist. 50% public citizen calculated between 1998 and 2004 of senators left to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. Those numbers have only gone up since then. Everyone depends within that beltway on this system surviving. And so in a world where they all depend on this system surviving, how could we possibly bring about a change? Now, in my book, in a lawyer-like way, 5 million pages long, I sort of go through all the possible ideas here. I have 4 ideas for how we could make a change. One is a normal idea, what we call a statute. The problem with the statute is, given the character of Congress right now, it's totally impossible to imagine Congress passing such a statute. So then I describe a series of insane ideas, but just happen to be improbable, but insane, including one which appeals to our framers, one device for allowing us to escape from a corrupted Congress, the idea of calling for a constitutional convention, so Congress doesn't control the amendments, but the people can, and then states have to ratify them. But all of these solutions are ways around what I think we need to recognize as a certain cancer that lives within the beltway, down within the district. And what makes it hard, incredibly hard, to imagine fighting against that is that we don't even know. We don't even know whether we can succeed. But what we do know is this. We do know what it's going to take to start this fight. And what it's going to take is a certain kind of courage. Certain kind of courage. First, the courage to stand up and reclaim an authority as a citizen. Whether it's from the right, the way the Tea Party has done it, or increasingly from the left, the way the Occupy movements have done it. But to stand up and to recognize that we are an extraordinarily diverse nation, people with very different views, and to recognize that in a democracy constituted by an extremely diverse nation, we have to find a way to find common ground that points to the change this system needs. We might not have common ends, but I want you to see that we have a common enemy. And the common enemy here is this corruption that makes it impossible for government to do what either the left or the right wants it to do. We need courage first to stand up and claim the right as citizens to fix this. And then we need a certain clarity, a focus, the focus of the route striker. So there's a local hero in Boston, a man named Arnold Hyatt. He's kind of a humble guy. This is the biggest picture I could find of him on the internet. He was president of Stride Rite. Stride Rite, of course, makes kids' shoes, great shoes, so maybe he's a hero for that reason alone, but I have a deeper, more important reason he's a hero for me. Hyatt is a loyal Democrat. That might not appeal to some of you. It does to me, but that's fine. In 1996, he was the second largest contributor to the Democratic Party. So in 1997, President Bill Clinton invited him and 30 other large contributors to a dinner at the Mayflower Hotel. It's a dinner of these fat cats. So these fat cats sat down around a table and were invited to tell the president what he thought the president should do. And Arnold was the last one to speak. We don't have a picture of the event. I kind of envision it like this. So Arnold stands up. And he looks the president straight in the eyes and he says, "Mr. President, I know you're an admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So I want you to put yourself in Roosevelt's shoes in 1940, when he reluctantly came to recognize that he needed to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy." Because he said, "Mr. President, you too need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. Not a war against fascists, a war against the ideology of fat cats, An ideology that believes that merely because you are rich, you are entitled to describe and direct public policy. Merely because you've been successful in the marketplace, you're entitled to get the president on the other end of the phone. People who have convinced most Americans that democracy does not work. After Arnold said that, you can imagine there was a certain amount of silence in this room, uncomfortable silence, as these fat cats had been called out by this man before the president. The only published account we have of the evening says that Clinton's response effectively slashed Hyatt to pieces, humiliating him in front of the group. Now, 15 years later, we need to recognize that it was Arnold Hyatt who was right. We do need to convince a reluctant nation to wage a war to save democracy. But where Arnold Hyatt was wrong was in his belief that it would be politicians who would wage that war. It's not politicians, it's citizens. It's us. It's root strikers. It's you. When Ben Franklin was carried out of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, he was stopped on the street by a woman who asked him, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it." A republic, a representative democracy, a democracy dependent upon the people alone. We have lost that republic. We all have to act to get it back. Thank you very much.